When he finished praying, I don't need that thing.
I'm gonna turn it off.
When he finished praying, John tells us, Jesus left with his disciples and they crossed the Kidron Valley. On the other side, there was a garden and they went into it. He doesn't tell us where they left from. They were probably near the temple or one of the temple courts. The Garden of Gethsemane was at the base of the Mount of Olives. Both Matthew and Mark tell us they went to Gethsemane. Mark 14:32, then they came to a place named Gethsemane. He told his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." Luke tells us that it was at the Mount of Olives. Luke 22:39, Jesus went out as usual to the Mount of Olives and his disciple followed him. I've never been there, but from these texts, we know that the Garden of Gethsemane was at the base of the Mount of Olives. He went there as usual. That's important. Jesus went out as usual. From this, we can know that since Jesus had returned to Jerusalem for that last week of his life, his nightly habit was to go to the Garden of Gethsemane. Maybe he spent the nights there. Maybe it was his nightly prayer routine. We don't know, but the point is, Judas knew he would be there at a certain time every night. Luke 21, verse 37, tells us that Jesus went there every night. Each day Jesus was teaching at the temple, and each evening he went out to spend the night on the hill called the Mount of Olives. In this account of this last night in Jesus' arrest, John tells us a few details that the other Gospels don't, and he leaves out a bunch of stuff that they do tell us. So we kind of look at the whole thing and get a good picture of it. John doesn't mention that agonizing prayer of Jesus where he was sweating blood, but he does mention some other things. And one thing that John does is he gets right down to the business of Jesus willingly giving himself up. They came to arrest him, but he stepped forward and gave himself up. John 18, verses 1 through 27. When he had finished praying, by the way, I think this is the most exciting part of John, this passage that we're doing today. They should make a TV show of it. When he finished praying, Jesus left with his disciples and crossed the Kidron Valley. On the other side, there was an olive grove, and he and his disciples went into it. Now, Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. So Judas came to the grove, guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and the Pharisees. They were carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked them, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "I am he," Jesus said. And Judas the traitor was standing there with them. When Jesus said, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Again he asked them, "Who is it you want?" They said, "Jesus of Nazareth." "I told you, I am he." Jesus answered, "If you're looking for me, then let these men go." This happened that the words he had spoken would be fulfilled. "I have not lost one of those you gave me." Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Jesus commanded Peter, "Put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?" Then the detachment of soldiers with its commander and Jewish officials arrested Jesus. They bound him, brought him first to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jews that it would be good if one man died for the people. Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus. Because this disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard. But Peter had to wait outside the door. The other disciple, who was known to the high priest, came back, spoke to the girl on duty there, and brought Peter in. "You're not one of this man's disciples, are you?" the girl asked Peter. "I am not." It was cold, and the servants and officials stood around the fire they had made to keep warm. Peter was also standing with them, warming himself. Meanwhile, the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. "I've spoken openly to the world," Jesus replied. "I always taught in the synagogues or at the temple, where all the Jews come together. I said nothing in secret. Why question me? Ask those who heard me. Surely they know what I said." Jesus said this. One of the officials nearby struck him in the face. "Is this the way you answer the high priest?" he demanded. "If I said something wrong, testify as to what is wrong. But if I spoke the truth, why did you strike me?" Then Annas sent him, still bound, to Caiaphas, the high priest. Simon Peter stood warming himself. He was asked, "You're not one of his disciples, are you?" "I am not." One of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, challenged him. "Didn't I see you with him in the olive grove?" Again, Peter denied it, and at that moment a rooster began to crow. The time schedule of God has arrived. Jesus went there on purpose. He went there so he'd be easy to find. The Jewish leaders had been wanting to arrest Jesus for a long time, but they were scared to because Jesus was popular. They couldn't afford a lot of trouble. They were afraid of a riot. They didn't want Rome to take away their power. Matthew 21:45, when the chief priests and Pharisees heard Jesus' parables, they knew he was talking about them. They looked for a way to arrest him, but they were afraid of the crowd because the people held that he was a prophet. It was time for Jesus to be offered up. Everything about Jesus operated on a time schedule. From his birth, actually from eternity past. Galatians 4:4 tells us, Paul tells us, but when the set time had fully come, God sent his son, born of a woman, born under the law. That last evening started with John's comments in chapter 13. So here we are on the last night of Jesus' life before he's put on the cross, and it's taken 6 chapters, 13 now through 18. John's gone into a lot of detail. It was just before the Passover, John 13:1. Jesus knew that the hour had come, John says. He knew it was time for him to leave the world and go to his Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. God planned it all. Planned it down to the minute, down to the second. And he planned it before anything was ever created. It was a determined plan, precisely calculated. Right on schedule. And Jesus approved of it. King James Version refers to it as the determinate counsel. The Christian Standard Bible calls it God's determined plan, or definite plan in the RSV. God's deliberate plan in the NIV. Peter referred to this planning session in his first big sermon in Acts chapter 2, beginning at verse 22. Fellow Israelites, listen to this. Jesus of Nazareth was a man accredited by God to you by miracles, wonders, and signs which God did among you through him, as you yourselves know. This man was handed over to you by God's deliberate plan and foreknowledge. And you, with the help of wicked men, put him to death by nailing him to a cross. But God raised him from the dead. Think about it like this. One of my Bible professors used to like to use this example. He said, God, which is Jesus the Son, the Father, and the Holy Spirit. That's God. Can't separate them. Before anything had ever been created, this was Stafford North, by the way, he said, they had a powwow. They got together and they figured out their creation plan. They knew they wanted to create man, but they knew man would mess it up. They gave him a perfect start and a choice to be perfect. So they knew they had to have a plan to fix it because they knew people were going to mess it up. And so the plan they came up with was this in their little powwow. Jesus, you're going to go down there since you're the Son. You're going to go down there and you're going to experience what it's like to be human. And part of that means you're going to experience what it's like to be to go through death, the worst kind of death on a cross. After the Last Supper, Jesus said in Luke 22:22, for the Son of Man will go away as it has been determined. It was a plan. It's not plan B. It's plan A. There is no plan B in God's plan. He had it figured out from before it ever started. Later, Peter will write in his first letter, 1 Peter 1:20, he was chosen before the foundation of the world and it was revealed at end times. Hundreds of years previous to Jesus, Isaiah wrote in Isaiah 53, yet the Lord was pleased to crush him severely. When you make him a restitution offering, he will see his seed, he will prolong his days, and by his hand the Lord's pleasure will be accomplished. It was a plan. On schedule. God spoke in Isaiah 46:10, I declare the end from the beginning. And from long ago, what is not yet done, saying, my plan will take place, and I will do my will. And Jesus was one of the planners as the Son. And he did it willingly. So when the hour had come, he made it easy for his opponents. He went to his regular place, the place he went every night. He went there late at night. He knew there wouldn't be any crowds, there wouldn't be any chance for a riot. A place where they could arrest him without fear of a riot. He made it easy. Basically, Jesus went to Judas. He knew Judas would look for him there, so that's where he went. He wasn't trying to hide. He was trying to make himself easy to find. Notice that Jesus went out to meet them when they showed up, and he identifies himself in a very dramatic way. Remember in John, the 7 I am statements. We've covered those. I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I'm the gate or the door, whichever way your translation says it. I'm the good shepherd. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the way and the truth and the life. And in John 15, I'm the true vine. The I am statements tell us who Jesus is. The Jewish people recognized I am as meaning deity. They recognized it as being God. In Exodus 3, beginning in verse 13, then Moses said to God, if I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, say this to the people of Israel, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever. He's saying, my name is I am forever. Every I am statement with a metaphor, those 7, that John gives us was something that these first century Jews could relate to. To believers, it brought encouragement. To the Jewish leaders, it just made them mad. So mad I can't even imagine it. But there are two more I ams in John that do not have a metaphor, that we don't talk about much. Jesus used it with the Samaritan woman. In John 4:25, the woman said, I know that Messiah, called Christ, is coming. When he comes, he will explain everything to us. Jesus declared, I, the one speaking to you, I am. Our translations add the word he. I am he. Original text does not have the he in there. Jesus didn't say I'm he. Jesus said, I am. She's the first person Jesus identified himself to as being God. And when they came to arrest Jesus, and I wish I could have seen this in person, I think I might have laughed. Judas came to the garden, guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and Pharisees. They were carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out to them and asked them, who do you want? We want Jesus of Nazareth. He replied, I am. Not I am he, like the English translation put it. He replied, I am. And Judas the traitor was standing there. When Jesus said, I am, they drew back and fell to the ground. Who is it you want? Jesus of Nazareth. I told you, I am. He could have put it another way. There's other ways of saying I am without saying it in the same way that God said it out of the burning bush, but he said it the same way. I am. That was Jesus telling them who he is, the Son of God, actually God himself, who came in human form. The author of all life and the source of eternal life. It was a good way of him telling them, because the Jewish leaders were standing there, you know that voice in the burning bush? That's me. And what about all those torches and weapons? I mean, really, do they need all that? Jesus never hurt a fly. All he did was help people. Those Jewish leaders were both bullies and wimps at the same time. They were afraid to carry out their own business, so they got all these armed soldiers, and they got a lot of them. You know, growing up, I just thought, well, there were some guys came out there and got Jesus and arrested him. You got to get into the text here so we understand what was going on. What we have here is a really mixed group of people. We've got soldiers, we've got civilians, we've got religious leaders, we've got pagans, Gentiles, Jews, a good representation of everyone Jesus died for. Matthew, Mark, and Luke describe it as a mob. Matthew 26, while he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, suddenly arrived. A large mob with swords and clubs was with him from the chief priest and the elders. Depending on your translation, John says there was a detachment of soldiers or a company of soldiers. Maybe it says a band of soldiers. The original Greek text says there was a cohort, a Roman cohort. That's 600 soldiers. 600 armed soldiers. And then the temple guards, we don't know how many of those there were. We don't know how many chief of the priests and the Pharisees and the Jewish leaders. But well over 600 people showed up to arrest Jesus, who had never hurt anyone ever. And did they really need those torches? Can you imagine 600 guys with torches? Jesus could have seen them coming from a mile away. Not only that, they didn't even need torches. It was Passover. That's full moon. It was probably as light as day out there almost. So what do they need those torches for? I'm thinking maybe they were figuring they're going to have to burn Jesus out. He's going to run and hide, and we're going to have to set that garden on fire and burn him out. I don't know why they had all those torches. And did they think it was strange that Jesus was so easy to find? Did they think it strange that he walked out to meet them and instantly identified himself? What really happened out there was Jesus taking control. Over 600 guys show up, they think they're in control, but Jesus took control. And when he announced his name as being God, I am, they couldn't stand in his presence. Over 600 guys fell backwards. And probably while they were still on the ground, he said, now who is it you said you wanted? Well, we're looking for Jesus of Nazareth. I am. I don't know how long it took these guys to get up. Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked him, who is it you want? Jesus stepping out is a picture of protection. He was protecting his 11 chosen apostles. He didn't want them hurt. Remember that prayer? John chapter 17 last week, while I was with them, I protected them and kept them safe. Him stepping out to those soldiers, he was protecting them. And John even adds commentary about that in this chapter, in verse 9. This happened so that the words he had spoken would be fulfilled. I've not lost one of those you gave me. Take me, but don't take them. Leave them alone. Interceding on their behalf. And that's basically what the whole prayer was in John chapter 17. That was Jesus interceding on their behalf and on our behalf, future believers. And it's a picture of what he continues to do for us every day. Paul said in Romans 8, second part of verse 34, Jesus Christ, who died, more than that, he was raised to life, is at the right hand of God, who is also interceding for us. In Hebrews 7:24, because Jesus lives forever, he has a permanent priesthood. Therefore, he is able to save completely those who come to God through him, because he always lives to intercede for them. He still is right now. He's interceding for us this very second. Well, in verse 10, Peter goes into action. Peter, you got to love the guy. Every time I think of Peter, I think of Rocky Balboa. Peter means rock, right? Peter, Jesus to Peter, you're the rock, man. You're Rocky. He jumps into action, cuts off the ear of Malchus. Either Malchus had good reflexes or Peter missed, because he was going for the middle of his head. He was going for the kill. Instead, he whacked off the guy's ear. But Jesus put his ear back on, or as some commentators think, he just created a new ear. I don't know what he did, but he healed him, Luke tells us. Luke 22. And what do these soldiers think of that? They're all standing there watching it. And what are those Jews, those Jewish leaders, what do they think? Oh, good grief, another miracle while we're trying to arrest him. Then the detachment of soldiers with its commander and the Jewish officials arrested Jesus. That word commander in the original Greek means a person over 1,000 men. Person over 1,000 men. They arrested Jesus and they bound him. John Calvin said this: the body of the Son of God was bound so that our souls might be freed from the cords of sin and death. He was tied up, like Abraham tied up Isaac. When they reached the place God told him about, Abraham built an altar and arranged the wood. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar. Well, God spared Isaac, but that wasn't the plan for Jesus. American Standard puts it like this in Psalm 118, verse 27, Jehovah is God. He hath given us light. Bind the sacrifice with cords even unto the horns of the altar. Literally from the Greek, John 18:12 says, and the cohort and the military commander and the assistants of the Jews took the Jesus and tied him up. I love that definite article. Took the Jesus. Not just any old Jesus. Jesus was a common name. They took the Jesus. They took God Jesus, the Jesus. The name above all names. The Jesus allowed himself to be arrested. He went and met him. He made it easy for him. He allowed himself to be tied up and nailed to the cross. Matthew 26 records these words of Jesus during this event. Do you not think I can call on my Father and will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? Legion is 6,000. That's 72,000 angels. That's 6,000 angels per person. 11 apostles and Jesus. He could have called 6,000 angels for each of them, 72,000 angels. That wasn't the plan. The plan was for him to be tied up and then nailed to the cross. His hour had come. It was part of the plan. Well, we come to Peter's denial. And John goes back and forth because these two events are happening at the same time. Two big events. Jesus' trial, because they take Jesus to Annas, it says. And Mark tells us that when they captured Jesus and they tied him up, everybody deserted him and fled. So all those guys run off. And there's two big events going on here at the same time that John tells us about. Jesus' trial and Peter denying Jesus. And he goes back and forth. Goes back and forth. John jumps right into the trial. They took Jesus to Annas. John's the only one that tells us that. So we put these gospel accounts together. He went to Annas first, the former high priest. Annas is what I call the godfather of the temple. And when we put together all these different gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and their details, we find out that there was actually 6 parts to the trial. 3 Jewish parts, 3 Roman parts. Probably look at more of that next week. We find that he went from Annas, and he went to Annas first, Annas to Caiaphas, and then at daybreak, he went in front of Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin. They sent him to Pilate, Pilate sent him to Herod, Herod sent him back to Pilate. 6 parts to the trial. John says he went to Annas first. We need to know who Annas is. We need to know who Annas is. Annas means merciful. That's ironic because this guy was anything but merciful. This guy was a thug. He was the official high priest for 10 years. Beginning at 6 AD through 15 AD, 6 years. He was kicked out of being high priest by the Roman governor of the time, Valerius Gratus, because he was becoming too powerful. Romans were getting afraid of him. Annas was like the mafia chief. He had 5 sons and a son-in-law, and all of them became high priests after Annas. Verse 13, they led him to Annas first. He was the father-in-law to Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year. Now Caiaphas was he that gave counsel to the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people. Caiaphas obviously had no idea what he was saying back there in John 11:15. John comments about it. Now this he. Now this he said not of himself, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus should die for the nation, not for the nation only, but that he might also gather together into one the children of God that are scattered abroad. Caiaphas prophesied that even though he didn't really know what he was saying. Annas was like the godfather of the temple. All these sons and sons-in-laws of his were like puppets. Annas hated Jesus. He hated Jesus. Here's what Josephus, the Roman historian, said about Annas. It is said that the elder Annas was extremely fortunate, for he had 5 sons, all of whom, after he himself had previously enjoyed the office for a very long period, became high priests of God, a thing that has never happened to any of our high priests. Josephus went on to say, Annas was greatly feared and respected by the people, but not in a good way. Everybody was afraid of Annas. And Annas hated Jesus because of what Jesus did to his businesses. Matthew 21, Jesus went into the temple complex and drove out all those buying and selling in the temple. He overturned the money changers' tables and the chairs and those selling doves, and he said to them, it is written, my house will be called a house of prayer, but you're making a den of thieves. All of those money changers and all of those guys that were in there selling animals for sacrifices not only cheated the people, but they had to give a kickback to Annas. Other Jewish writings describe those businesses in the temple as the marketplace of the family of Annas, or the bazaar of Annas. He owned that market. He owned those guys. They had to pay him to be there. Jesus was bad for his business, and he wanted Jesus dead. And so they took him to Annas first. So now John shifts. Because at the same time Jesus is before Annas, Peter's out there denying him. Peter's with another disciple, an unnamed disciple. Had to be John. John doesn't ever identify himself by name in this book. And this disciple has friends. He's a friend of the high priest family. That makes sense, which we don't really have time to go into now, but John's mother, Salome, was related to Jesus' mother. They were cousins somewhere or another. Jesus' mother was related to Elizabeth, whose husband was Zachariah, who was a priest, a good priest who fulfilled his duties. So naturally, they knew the high priest family. And so John gets to go in. Peter has to stay outside. John talks to the girl. She goes to the temple, the gatekeeper. It's common for the gatekeeper to be girls, women. She goes out, lets Peter in. You're one of his disciples, aren't you? No. Peter goes over to the fire to get warm with some of the servants and officials of the priest, some of the guys who were in the garden. And then John shifts back to the trial in verse 19. Verses 19 through 24 give us a glimpse of what went on, the questions Annas was asking Jesus. Jesus doesn't answer to his satisfaction, so one of his assistants, literally in the original language, slaps him across the face. Not liking Jesus' answer, because he knew Jesus was right, Annas goes ahead and just sends Jesus to Caiaphas. Second part of the trial. Verse 25, John shifts back to Peter because it's all going on at the same time. The guys at the fire ask him, you're one of his disciples, aren't you? No. Second denial. Then a relative of Malchus, the guy Peter attacked, an eyewitness to it. Didn't I see you in the garden with him? No. And at that moment, the rooster began to crow. Why did Peter deny Jesus? He was scared to death. The guy he'd been trusting in, the guy he thought was going to lead a military victory, had been arrested. He's very confused. He tried to defend Jesus. I mean, there's over 600 armed soldiers, and yet Peter pulls a sword and whacks off the ear of one of the Jewish servants. He did risk his life for Jesus. Jesus called him off, and in calling him off, he saved Peter's life. Because if Peter had went on, he would have surely been killed. We can be too hard on Peter. To his credit, he did followed at a distance to see what's going on with Jesus, what's going to happen. He told Jesus earlier he would defend him with his life, and he tried to, but Jesus knew what would happen. This very night you will fall away on account of me, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered, Matthew 26. But after I've risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee. Peter replied, even if all fall away, I never will. Truly, I tell you, Jesus answered, this very night before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. And in Luke 22, Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift you as of wheat, but I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail. Lord, I'm ready to go with you to prison and to death. Jesus answered, I tell you, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. Peter had a temporary setback. But Jesus prayed for him, and later Peter came back. I'm not sure there's any of us who haven't had a temporary setback. So if you don't take away anything else from this lesson, remember this. No matter what goes wrong, no matter how bad things get, Jesus will step up and take control. He is in charge, and Jesus remains faithful even though sometimes we don't. And so we need to be on guard. I think Peter was caught off guard. All this surprised him. Even though he had been warned by Jesus what was going to happen, it just didn't sink in. And he was caught off guard, and he denied Jesus, and he was scared. And sometimes we're scared and we're caught off guard. Let's pray that we are not caught off guard so that we can be faithful too. Let's close in prayer. Larry, would you lead?